It was supposed to be just another summer visit, one of those family gatherings where you smile politely and count the hours until you can leave. But this particular summer changed everything for our family. And looking back now, I can see how all the warning signs were there, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon before the tempest finally breaks. My name is Rachel, and this story isn't just mine. It belongs to my cousin Sarah, too. And in many ways, it's about how we both learned to stand up to the most controlling person either of us had ever known. Her mother, my Aunt Margaret. Some people are born with a sense of entitlement that runs so deep it becomes part of their DNA. And Margaret was one of those people. She didn't just expect the world to revolve around her, she demanded it. And heaven help anyone who suggested otherwise. I remember that summer with crystal clarity, not just because I have what my mother always called an elephant's memory, but because it was marked by two profound losses in my life. It was the first trip I took after my father passed away from a long battle with illness, and tragically, it would be the last trip I ever took with my mother. She died less than a year later, leaving a hole in my heart that even now, decades later, still aches when I think about her warm smile and gentle wisdom. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. From that sweltering July day when I arrived at Sarah's apartment in Boston, ready for what I thought would be a fun few weeks of tourist activities and cousin bonding. Sarah was 22 then, fresh out of college with her nursing degree, living in a cozy one-bedroom apartment near the hospital where she worked. She'd always been the responsible one, the daughter who did everything right, at least according to Aunt Margaret's impossible standards. The problem was, Margaret's idea of doing everything right meant that Sarah existed solely to serve her mother's whims. Need a babysitter for a friend's child? Oh, Sarah can do it. Someone needs their house cleaned or errands run? Sarah's available, of course. Garden needs weeding, groceries need buying, elderly neighbor needs a ride to the doctor. Sarah, Sarah, Sarah. It didn't matter if Sarah had plans, was exhausted from a 12-hour shift at the hospital, or simply wanted a day to herself. In Margaret's mind, Sarah's only purpose in life was to be her personal unpaid assistant available 24/7. My mother and I had arrived at Sarah's apartment around 3 in the afternoon. Mom had insisted on driving me there herself, even though I'd offered to take the train. She was protective like that, especially after Dad's death. We'd become even closer in those months after we lost him, leaning on each other through the grief. She helped Sarah and me carry my luggage up to the third-floor apartment, and we were just settling in with iced tea and catching up when everything started to unravel. Sarah had been telling us about her boyfriend, Michael, a sweet guy she'd met at the hospital where he worked as a physical therapist. They'd been dating for about 6 months, and the way her eyes lit up when she talked about him told me everything I needed to know about how serious things were getting. My mother was asking all the typical mom questions. When did they meet? What were his intentions? Did he treat her well? When the phone rang, Sarah glanced at the caller ID and her whole body tensed. The joy that had been animating her face just seconds before drained away like water down a sink. She looked at us apologetically and answered. And even though she didn't put it on speaker, we could hear every word. Aunt Margaret's voice has always had this quality that could cut through walls, a shrillness that seemed designed by nature to make everyone within a 5-mile radius uncomfortable. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, how dare you embarrass me like this? The words came flying through the phone like daggers. Mrs. Patterson just called me, absolutely mortified that you didn't show up to clean her house as promised. Do you have any idea how this makes me look? I gave her my word that you would be there. I watched Sarah's face as she held the phone slightly away from her ear. There was exhaustion there, but also something else, something I hadn't seen before. Determination, maybe. Or just the last straw finally landing on an already broken camel's back. Mom, Sarah said, her voice remarkably calm. I never agreed to clean Mrs. Patterson's house. You volunteered me without asking, just like you always do. I told you yesterday that I had plans today. Plans? Margaret's voice went up another octave, which I wouldn't have thought possible. What plans could possibly be more important than helping my dear friend? You're being selfish and ungrateful after everything I've done for you. My mother and I exchanged glances. She knew the dynamic between Margaret and Sarah, we all did, but witnessing it firsthand was something else entirely. My mother had never gotten along with her younger sister. They were as different as fire and ice. My mother warm and nurturing, Margaret cold and controlling. Mom, I'm 22 years old, Sarah said, and I could hear years of frustration finally bubbling to the surface. I don't live in your house anymore. You don't pay my bills. The car I drive? I bought it myself with money I earned from my job. You don't get to volunteer me for things anymore. How dare you speak to me that way? I'm your mother. You will call Mrs. Patterson right now and apologize, and then you will go clean her house. And you're grounded for a month, young lady. No car privileges, no going out, nothing. I nearly choked on my iced tea. Grounded? A 22-year-old woman with her own apartment and job? Even for Margaret, this was reaching new levels of delusion. Sarah's response was perfect. Mom, you can't ground me. I'm an adult. I'm hanging up now. We can talk when you've calmed down. But Margaret wasn't done. Don't you dare hang up on me, Sarah Elizabeth. If you do, I'm coming over there right now and… Click. Sarah hung up and looked at us with a mixture of defiance and anxiety. She's going to lose her mind, she said, but there was a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I should have done that years ago. My mother stood up then, smoothing down her skirt in that way she did when she was nervous. Girls, I think I should head home. Sarah, honey, you did the right thing. Don't let her bully you. She hugged us both, and I could see the worry in her eyes as she left. She knew Margaret better than anyone, knew what she was capable of, but she also knew that Sarah needed to fight this battle herself. Michael arrived about an hour later, and the four of us headed out to a water park about 40 minutes away. It was one of those perfect summer afternoons where the heat wasn't too oppressive and the park wasn't too crowded. For a few hours, we forgot about the drama with Margaret and just enjoyed ourselves. Sarah taught me how to body surf in the wave pool, and Michael and I ganged up on her in a splash fight that left us all gasping with laughter. We stopped for dinner at this little Italian place on the way home, one of those family-owned restaurants where the pasta is handmade and the owner's grandmother's sauce recipe is treated like a state secret. My mother had insisted on treating us, pressing money into Sarah's hand before she left, despite all protests. The four of us sat on the outdoor patio, twinkle lights strung overhead, sharing stories and garlic bread. Sarah seemed lighter than I'd seen her in years, like standing up to her mother had lifted a weight she'd been carrying for far too long. It was nearly 10 o'clock when we got back to Sarah's apartment building. The first sign that something was wrong was the empty parking space where Sarah's little Honda Civic should have been. She'd parked it there that morning. I'd seen her lock it myself. We stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space like if we looked hard enough, the car would materialize. Maybe it got towed? Michael suggested. But we could all see the other cars parked in the resident spaces, including one that had been there so long it had leaves piled on its windshield. Sarah's phone rang, and we all knew who it would be before she even looked at the screen. This time she did put it on speaker. Hi, Mom, Sarah said, her voice carefully neutral. Do you know where my car is? Of course I know where your car is, Margaret replied, triumph dripping from every word. I have it. Your father brought me over to check on you, to see if you'd come to your senses and apologize to Mrs. Patterson. When I found you weren't home, despite being grounded, I decided to take the car. You're clearly not responsible enough to have it. I watched the color drain from Sarah's face, then flood back in a wave of anger. Mom, that's stealing. Bring my car back right now. It's not stealing when a mother disciplines her child. I'll be keeping the car for a month, and I've already told Mrs. Patterson she can borrow it whenever she needs to run errands. Maybe this will teach you some respect. If you don't bring my car back in the next hour, I'm calling the police and reporting it stolen, Sarah said, her voice shaking but determined. Margaret laughed, an ugly sound that made my skin crawl. Don't be ridiculous. I'm your mother. The police will just laugh at you for wasting their time. I have every right to take that car. Everything you have is mine because I'm your mother. That's how it works. No, Mom, that's not how it works at all. You have 1 hour. I don't think so, Missy. You need to learn your place. You're the child, I'm the parent, and what I say goes. Forever. That's the law. Sarah hung up and looked at us. Tears of rage were streaming down her face, but there was steel in her spine. She looked at me, knowing what this would mean. Margaret had always hated me, saw me as a bad influence on her perfect daughter. If Sarah called the police, Margaret would know I was there, and the fallout would be epic. I can handle whatever she throws at me, I told her. Make the call. And she did. She called the police, reported her car stolen, and gave them the address where it could be found. Then we waited. Michael drove us over to Margaret's house in his pickup truck, parking across the street where we could watch the show unfold. We didn't have to wait long. 2 police cruisers pulled up within 15 minutes, and 2 officers got out and approached the front door. Margaret answered the door, And even from across the street, we could see her shift into performance mode. She was all smiles and batting eyelashes, the concerned mother just trying to do right by her wayward daughter. But the officers weren't buying it. We couldn't hear the exact words from where we sat, but we could see the gestures, the body language. Margaret pointed at the car in the driveway, obviously explaining that it was her right as a mother to take it. One of the officers shook his head and said something that made Margaret's smile falter. Then he noticed us across the street and waved us over. As we crossed the street, I could see Margaret's expression when she spotted me. If looks could kill, I would have been reduced to a small pile of ash on her perfectly manicured lawn. But I kept walking, standing beside Sarah as we approached the officers. "I'm Officer Martinez," the younger of the two said, "and this is Officer Johnson. Which one of you called about the stolen vehicle?" "I did," Sarah said, her voice steady now. "That's my car in the driveway. My mother took it without my permission." "She's lying," Margaret interjected, her voice taking on that sugary, sweet tone she used when she was trying to manipulate people. "I'm her mother. I was simply disciplining her for being disrespectful and disobedient. She's throwing a tantrum because I grounded her from using the car." Officer Johnson, who looked like he'd been doing this job for a long time and had seen it all, raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, how old is your daughter?" "That's irrelevant," Margaret snapped, the sugar dissolving from her voice. "I'm her mother. She has to obey me. It's the law. Tell her, officers." "Actually, ma'am," Officer Martinez said patiently, "there's no law that says an adult child has to obey their parent. Your daughter appears to be over 18, which makes her an adult in the eyes of the law." "I don't care if she's 50, Margaret shrieked, all pretense of sweetness gone. "I'm her mother. I have rights. I can take her car whenever I want." "May I see the registration and your license?" Officer Johnson asked Sarah, who promptly handed them over. He examined them carefully, then showed the registration to Margaret. "This vehicle is registered solely in your daughter's name. You have no legal right to take it without her permission, regardless of your relationship." What happened next still makes me shake my head in disbelief, even all these years later. Margaret snatched Sarah's license right out of Officer Johnson's hand and slammed the door in their faces. The two officers looked at each other, clearly not believing what had just happened, then rang the doorbell again. When Margaret opened the door this time, she was holding something in her hand with a look of triumph on her face. She handed Officer Johnson what turned out to be Sarah's license, now cut into several pieces. "There," she said, looking immensely pleased with herself. "Now she can't drive because she doesn't have a license. Problem solved." The silence that followed was deafening. We all stared at her, trying to process the fact that a grown woman had just destroyed government property in front of two police officers and thought she'd somehow won. It was then that Margaret finally noticed me standing there. Her face contorted with rage. "You! What are you doing here? Didn't give you permission to visit my daughter. Where's your mother? You need to leave immediately." "I don't need your permission to visit my cousin," I said calmly, "and my mother already left. I'm 18, Aunt Margaret. I can travel without her supervision." Officer Johnson cleared his throat. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for destruction of government property and grand theft auto." The look on Margaret's face was priceless. "You can't arrest me. I'm her mother. I know my rights." "Yes, ma'am, you do have rights," Officer Martinez said as his partner turned Margaret around and placed handcuffs on her wrists. "You have the right to remain silent." As they read her rights, Sarah ran into the house to tell her father what was happening. I'd always felt sorry for Uncle Robert. He was a quiet man who'd learned long ago that the path of least resistance was the only way to survive being married to Margaret. He came out looking tired and resigned, like he'd been expecting this day to come eventually. The officers were remarkably patient, explaining to us that they'd been willing to just issue Margaret a citation and let her appear before a judge to pay a fine. But destroying the license had escalated things significantly. Apparently, destroying a government-issued ID was a felony in Massachusetts, something none of us had known. We spent the next few hours at the police station giving statements. Sarah was able to get a temporary paper license that night, and I drove her car back to her apartment while Michael followed in his truck. Uncle Robert had already called their attorney, a man who'd apparently never actually met Margaret before and was in for quite a surprise. The preliminary hearing was set for the following week, and we all showed up. Even my mother, who drove back up from Connecticut despite my assurances that I was fine. The courtroom was small, and Margaret sat at the defendant's table looking indignant rather than remorseful. Her attorney, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Your Honor, the attorney began, this is simply a family matter that's gotten out of hand. It's just a case of a mother disciplining her child, and the child calling the police because she didn't like being grounded from using the car. The judge, a woman who looked to be in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes, leaned forward. So the defendant got angry and called the police? Well, yes, Your Honor. And not knowing it was a crime to destroy the license, she did so in a moment of frustration. I see. The judge turned to the prosecutor. Do you have anything to add? The prosecutor, a young woman who looked fresh out of law school but had a confidence that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing, stood up. Your Honor, I think it's important to note that the victim in this case is a 22-year-old woman who lives independently, supports herself, and owns the vehicle in question. This isn't a matter of a parent disciplining a minor child. This is theft, pure and simple. The defendant took property that didn't belong to her and then destroyed a government document when confronted by law enforcement. She's my daughter, Margaret suddenly shouted, ignoring her attorney's attempts to quiet her. I have every right to take her car. She was being disrespectful. Tell them, Robert. Uncle Robert, who was sitting in the gallery, seemed to shrink into his seat. The judge banged her gavel. Ma'am, you'll have your chance to speak. Until then, you need to be quiet. I will not be quiet. This is a travesty of justice. I know my rights. The judge's expression hardened. Counselor, please control your client, or I'll have her removed from the courtroom. The attorney whispered urgently to Margaret, who sat back in her chair but continued to mutter under her breath. The hearing continued, with the prosecutor outlining the facts of the case. When she mentioned that Margaret had also indicated her intention to loan the stolen vehicle to a third party, the judge's eyebrows rose even higher. In the end, Margaret was released on her own recognizance with conditions. She was not to contact Sarah except through attorneys, not to go near Sarah's apartment or workplace, and definitely not to go anywhere near Sarah's vehicle. A trial date was set for 2 months later. You might think this would have been a wake-up call for Margaret, a moment of clarity where she realized she'd gone too far. You'd be wrong. If anything, it made her worse. She began a campaign of harassment that would have been impressive if it weren't so disturbing. She called Sarah's work and tried to get her fired, claiming her daughter was a drug addict who was stealing medications. She contacted Sarah's landlord and said her daughter was running a prostitution ring out of the apartment. She even called Michael's mother and told her that Sarah was pregnant with another man's baby. Fortunately, everyone who knew Sarah also knew Margaret, or at least knew of her reputation. The hospital where Sarah worked had already dealt with Margaret's craziness over the years and simply added the calls to a file they were keeping. The landlord, who'd rented to Sarah for 2 years without a single complaint, told Margaret that if she called again, he'd be getting a restraining order. Michael's mother, bless her heart, told Margaret exactly where she could stick her lies and hung up on her. The trial, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. Margaret's attorney tried to argue that this was all a misunderstanding, that Margaret had simply been trying to teach her daughter a lesson about responsibility. The prosecutor, meanwhile, presented a clear case of theft and destruction of property, with the added bonus of Margaret's behavior in the months since the arrest showing a clear pattern of harassment and inability to accept that her daughter was an independent adult. She ran to the judge because Margaret died 2 years later from a heart attack, still estranged from Sarah, still convinced that the entire world was wrong and she was the victim. There was no funeral, no memorial service. Sarah had her cremated and scattered the ashes in the ocean, which Margaret had always feared because she never learned to swim. It might seem harsh, but when someone spends decades making your life miserable, it's hard to summon up much grief when they're gone. Sarah is doing wonderfully now. She married Michael 3 years ago in a beautiful beach ceremony that was everything Margaret would have hated, which made it perfect. They have 2 kids, a boy and a girl, and Sarah is the kind of mother Margaret never was. Loving, supportive, and respectful of her children as individuals rather than extensions of herself. But our story doesn't end with Margaret's arrest. In fact, that was just the beginning of a larger pattern of control and manipulation that had been festering in our family for years. You see, Margaret's need to control everyone around her wasn't limited to her daughter. I would learn this firsthand just a few years later, when my own parents were facing their darkest hour. It was 3 years after the incident with Sarah's car when my world began to crumble. I was 15, just starting my sophomore year of high school, when my parents sat me down for the conversation no teenager should have to have. My mother had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of ovarian cancer. The doctors gave her 2 years at most. My father, already weakened from his own battle with lung disease that had been slowly stealing his breath for years, seemed to age a decade overnight at the news. I remember sitting in our living room, the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows, casting long shadows across my mother's face as she held my hands and told me that everything was going to be okay, even though we all knew it wasn't. My father sat beside her, his oxygen tank humming softly, reaching over occasionally to squeeze her shoulder or brush away a tear. "We need to make plans," my mother said in that practical way of hers. "For after." I didn't want to talk about after. I wanted to pretend this wasn't happening, that if we just didn't acknowledge it, maybe it would go away. But my parents had always treated me like an adult in many ways, respecting my intelligence and maturity, and they weren't going to stop now just because the truth was painful. They'd already made most of the arrangements. I would be emancipated, they explained, which would give me legal rights to make my own decisions about school, medical care, and finances. It was necessary because of my unique situation. I'd skipped several grades and was already taking college courses at 15. The university system didn't quite know what to do with someone who was technically too young to drop out of high school, but was already beyond high school academically. Emancipation would protect me legally until I turned 18. My brother Louis lived nearby with his 2 young daughters. He'd been through a difficult divorce, but had managed to get full custody, and he'd already offered to be there for me in whatever way I needed. My other brother, James, lived further away but called weekly and visited when he could. I had a support system, my parents assured me. I wouldn't be alone. Financially, they'd made sure I'd be okay. The house would be mine, paid off thanks to life insurance policies they'd taken out years before. There was money set aside for my education and living expenses. They'd thought of everything, planned for every contingency except for one. Aunt Margaret. We should have known she'd insert herself into the situation. Margaret had always believed that her way was the only way, that her decisions were the only correct ones, and that everyone else's opinions were not just wrong, but irrelevant. The fact that she'd been legally barred from controlling her own daughter hadn't taught her anything. If anything, it had made her more determined to find someone else to control. It was an August day that felt like the inside of an oven when everything came to a head. The humidity was so thick you could practically swim through the air, and by 7 in the morning, it was already 90 degrees. I'd spent the morning at the university, registering for my fall classes and buying textbooks. Anyone who went to college in the late 80s and early 90s knows what a nightmare that was. Hours of standing in lines, only to find out the class you needed was full or had been canceled. Spending hundreds of dollars on textbooks you'd probably never open. Fighting for parking spaces, dealing with a registration system that seemed designed by someone who actively hated students. By the time I got home, I was hot, sweaty, exhausted, and in no mood for company. I hauled my books up to my room, took a quick shower, and was just starting to feel human again when I opened my bathroom door to find my 5-year-old niece, Nicole, sitting on my bed looking uncharacteristically annoyed. Nicole was Louis's older daughter, usually sunny and cheerful, the kind of kid who found joy in everything from puddles to pancakes. To see her looking genuinely irritated was unusual enough to immediately put me on alert. "Hey, Nick," I said, sitting down beside her. "What's wrong? Did Annie do something?" Annie was her 3-year-old sister, and sibling squabbles were not uncommon. "No," she said, kicking her feet against the bed frame. "Grammy wants you in the kitchen. There are strange people there." Strange people? I felt my stomach drop. My mother hadn't mentioned expecting anyone. "A lady," Nicole said, wrinkling her nose. "I don't like her. She's using the fake nice voice, and Grammy is using her fake nice voice back." Even at 5, Nicole had inherited the family talent for reading people. If she said someone was using a fake nice voice, it meant trouble. "What's the lady's name?" Nicole screwed up her face, trying to remember. She said to call her Aunt Margaret? I'm pretty sure I said a word that 5-year-olds shouldn't hear. Nicole's eyes went wide, and then she giggled. "You said a bad word." "Yes, I did, and don't you repeat it. Listen, Nick, I want you to stay in here with Annie, okay? If you need to leave this room for any reason, you come find me first. Don't go anywhere with the strange lady, no matter what she says." Nicole nodded solemnly. She might have been only 5, but she understood serious when she heard it. I made sure Annie was safely occupied with some toys, then steeled myself and headed for the kitchen. I could hear Margaret's voice before I even rounded the corner, that particular tone she used when she was pretending to be reasonable and caring. It was like nails on a chalkboard if the chalkboard was also pretending to be your friend. And of course, we have so much more space than you do here, she was saying as I entered the kitchen. The schools in our district are excellent, and Emily could help her with. She turned as I entered, and I swear her jaw literally dropped. It was almost comical, like something out of a cartoon. I'd had a growth spurt in the 3 years since she'd last seen me, shooting up to 5'7", though I was still skinny and pale, with the kind of white blonde hair that ran in my father's Norwegian side of the family. My mother sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she wasn't drinking. She looked tired, which wasn't unusual these days, but there was a tension in her shoulders that told me she'd been dealing with Margaret for a while already. My father sat beside her, his oxygen cannula in place, looking somewhere between amused and annoyed. "Rachel," my mother said, and I could hear the relief in her voice. "How was registration?" "About what I expected," I said, not taking my eyes off Margaret. "I got into everything I needed and most of what I wanted." "What's she doing here?" Margaret's face flushed at my rudeness, but she recovered quickly, pasting on that fake smile Nicole had detected. "Rachel, my, how you've grown. I was just telling your parents about my wonderful idea." "Were you?" I said flatly. It wasn't a question. "Yes. You see, I heard about your parents' situation, and I've come up with the perfect solution." "Did you discover a cure for cancer?" I asked. "Because that would indeed be perfect. Assume you'll be sharing it with the medical community immediately. I'll start preparing your Nobel Prize acceptance speech." Margaret's smile flickered. "Don't be flippant, young lady. I'm here to help." "Then you can resurrect the dead too? Impressive. I'll call the Vatican. They'll want to know about this miracle." "Rachel," my mother said softly, but I could see she was fighting back a smile. "Don't sass your elders," Margaret snapped, dropping the nice act for a moment before catching herself. "Your mother raised you better than that." "I helped," my father interjected mildly. "Might explain a few things." "The point is," Margaret pressed on, "you're going to need somewhere to go after, and I'm here to offer you a home with us." I stared at her for a long moment, then burst out laughing. I couldn't help it. The idea was so absurd, so completely removed from reality, that laughter was the only possible response. "You're joking," I said when I finally caught my breath. "Please tell me you're joking." "I'm perfectly serious. You'll come live with us, transfer to Sarah's old high school. You're probably not as advanced as you think you are anyway. I'm sure you'll do fine in regular classes." "Okay, let's break this down," I said, counting on my fingers. "First, I have 2 brothers, both of whom have already offered to help however I need it. Second, I have a house to live in and a car to drive. Third, I have money thanks to my parents' careful planning. Fourth, I'm about to be legally emancipated, which means I make my own decisions. Fifth, if I were going to live with any aunt and uncle, it would be Aunt Linda and Uncle Steve, who actually like me and have already offered. And finally, and most importantly, your opinion on this matter is worth exactly nothing. Less than nothing, actually, since your involvement in any situation tends to make it worse." Margaret's face had gone from red to purple. "You're a child. You can't possibly live on your own. I'm the adult here, and I say—" "I'm 15, I interrupted. "But thanks for stating the obvious. By the way, Boston University called last month. I turned them down. Told them I didn't want to live that close to my delusional aunt who thinks the world revolves around her." "How dare you?" "I dare because I can, because I'm not Sarah and I'm not afraid of you. You have no power here, Margaret. You're a sad, controlling woman who drove away her own daughter and now thinks she can swoop in and claim someone else's. It's pathetic." "I'm trying to help," Margaret shrieked, all pretense of calm gone. "You need guidance. You need an adult in charge." "We're not dead yet," my father said quietly, and the words hung heavy in the air. "Rachel has adults in charge, her parents, and we've made arrangements for her care that don't involve you." "But the answer is no, Margaret," my mother said firmly. "We appreciate your offer." I snorted at that. "But Rachel's future is already settled. She'll be staying here, finishing her education, and living her life on her terms. Margaret turned back to me, and there was something wild in her eyes. You're 15, a child. You can't possibly go to university. I'm majoring in psychology, I said calmly. Planning to be a psychiatrist, actually. Maybe someday I can figure out what's wrong with you and have you committed. That was when I made my mistake. It'd been a long, frustrating day, and Margaret's presence was like salt in an open wound. My parents were dying, and here was this woman trying to capitalize on our tragedy for her own twisted needs. So when she started another rant about respect and obedience and knowing one's place, I said the only thing I'd ever said in front of my parents that I truly regretted. You can go fuck yourself. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's eyes widened, my father choked on air, which, given his oxygen situation, was concerning, and Margaret looked like I'd slapped her. Are you going to allow her to speak to me like that? Margaret demanded. My parents exchanged a look. One of those married couple communications that doesn't need words. When she says something we disagree with, my father said finally, we'll let her know. It took Margaret a moment to process this. When she did, she turned an even deeper shade of purple. This is exactly why she needs proper guidance. She's rude, disrespectful, ungrateful. She's standing right here, I said, and she's done listening to you. Get out of our house. Margaret stayed for 3 more days. 3 long, miserable days where she criticized everything from our housekeeping, my mother was dying of cancer, and my father could barely breathe. But sure, let's worry about dust on the baseboards. To my clothing choices, apparently jeans and t-shirts weren't appropriate for a young lady. To the food we ate. Processed foods would kill us, she said, apparently missing the irony. I didn't speak another word to her after that first confrontation. When she spoke to me, I simply walked away. When she criticized me to my parents, they defended me. When she tried to corner me alone, I made sure I was never alone. Louis took time off work to run interference, keeping his girls away from her and making sure I always had an escape route. The really funny thing about those 3 days was watching my parents handle her. They'd been dealing with her for longer than I'd been alive, and they'd perfected the art of malicious compliance. When Margaret complained about the dust, my mother sweetly asked her to write down all her concerns so we could address them after she left. When she criticized our food, my father thanked her for her input and continued eating his processed sandwich with obvious enjoyment. When she tried to reorganize our kitchen because it wasn't efficient, my mother just smiled and said how thoughtful it was for Margaret to want to help, then put everything back the moment she left the room. By the time Margaret finally left, we were all exhausted but oddly triumphant. We'd survived Hurricane Margaret without major damage, and we'd done it together, as a family. My parents lived longer than the doctors predicted. My mother made it 3 years instead of 2, long enough to see me graduate from high school at 16 and start medical school at 17. My father held on for another year after that, long enough to see me settle into my college routine and prove that, yes, I could take care of myself. Those years weren't easy. Watching the 2 people you love most in the world slowly fade away is a special kind of torture, but we made the most of the time we had. We took trips when they were feeling up to it, had movie marathons when they weren't. I learned to cook my mother's recipes and recorded my father telling all his terrible dad jokes. We talked about everything and nothing, storing up memories like a squirrel storing nuts for winter. Louis stepped up in ways I never could have imagined. He became not just a brother, but a friend. A confidant, a protector when I needed one. He helped me navigate the legal system for my emancipation, drove me to college when I needed rides, and made sure I ate actual meals instead of living on coffee and determination. His daughters became like little sisters to me, and their innocent joy helped balance out the sadness that threatened to overwhelm us all. After my parents died, I stayed in the house. It was paid for, it was familiar, and it was full of memories. Threw myself into my studies, determined to become the kind of doctor who could help families like ours navigate the medical system with compassion and clarity. I dated occasionally, but never seriously. Too focused on my goals to make room for romance. I kept tabs on Sarah through holiday cards and occasional phone calls. She was thriving, working as a nurse practitioner now, specializing in pediatrics. She and Michael had bought a house in the suburbs, adopted a rescue dog that thought it was a lapdog despite weighing 80 pounds, and seemed genuinely happy. Margaret died alone. That sounds harsh, but it was the reality she created for herself. She'd driven away her daughter, alienated her extended family, and even her long-suffering husband had finally had enough. Robert had filed for divorce a year before she died, moving in with Sarah and Michael while he got back on his feet. The stress of losing control over everyone in her life apparently took its toll on Margaret's heart, and she died of a massive heart attack at the age of 63. Sarah called me when it happened. I could hear the complexity of emotions in her voice. Grief for the mother Margaret could have been, relief that the torment was finally over, guilt for feeling that relief, and a strange kind of emptiness. "I don't know how to feel," she admitted. "She was my mother, but she was also your tormentor," I finished. "It's okay to have complicated feelings about complicated people." There was no funeral, as I mentioned. Margaret had burned every bridge she'd ever built, and in the end, there was no one left who wanted to mourn her. Sarah had her cremated, and yes, she really did scatter the ashes in the ocean. When she told me about it, there was a defiant satisfaction in her voice. "She was terrified of water," Sarah said. "Never learned to swim because she couldn't stand not being in control." Seemed fitting. Some might see it as cruel, but I understood. When someone spends decades making your life hell, sometimes the only closure you can get is ensuring they can't control anything ever again, even in death. I'm in my 40s now, a successful psychiatrist with a practice specializing in family trauma and recovery from emotional abuse. I never married, but I have a rich, full life surrounded by chosen family and the biological family members who proved themselves worthy of the title. Lewis and I remain close, and his daughters, now grown with children of their own, still call me Aunt Rachel. Sarah and I reconnected properly after Margaret's death, and we've built the cousin relationship we should have had all along. We meet for lunch once a month, take our kids, she has 2. I'm the proud aunt to several nieces and nephews, on joint vacations, and support each other through life's ups and downs. Michael turned out to be exactly the kind of partner Sarah needed. Supportive, kind, and with a backbone of steel when it came to protecting his family. Looking back on that summer when I was 18, when Sarah finally stood up to her mother and everything exploded, I can see it was a turning point for our entire family. It was the moment we all stopped pretending that Margaret's behavior was normal or acceptable. It was when we stopped enabling her delusions of grandeur and control. The really sad thing is that it didn't have to be that way. Margaret could have been a loving mother and aunt. She could have had relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection instead of control and manipulation. She had every opportunity to change, to grow, to become a better person. She just chose not to. I see echoes of Margaret in my practice all the time. Parents who view their children as extensions of themselves rather than individual human beings. People who believe that family ties give them the right to control and manipulate. Adults who've never learned that respect is earned, not demanded, and that true authority comes from wisdom and kindness, not from titles or positions. The tragedy of Margaret wasn't that she was controlling, it was that she chose to die rather than change. But this story isn't really about Margaret, not at its heart. It's about Sarah and me and everyone else who's ever had to stand up to someone who claimed authority over their lives. It's about the courage it takes to say no when everyone expects you to say yes. It's about learning that you have the right to live your own life on your own terms, regardless of what anyone else thinks. Sarah showed me that courage that summer day when she hung up on her mother. She showed it again when she called the police, when she testified in court, when she refused to back down even when things got ugly. And in doing so, she gave me the strength to stand up to Margaret myself when my turn came. We all have Margarets in our lives. Maybe not as extreme, maybe not as persistent, but we all know someone who thinks they have the right to control us, to make our decisions for us, to volunteer us for things without our consent. The lesson I learned from that summer and from all the years that followed is that we don't have to accept it. We have the right to say no. We have the right to set boundaries. We have the right to live our own lives. It's not always easy. Standing up to controlling people often comes with consequences. Relationships may be damaged or even ended. There may be family drama, gossip, judgment from people who don't understand. But the alternative, living under someone else's control, sacrificing your own happiness and autonomy for the sake of keeping peace, is far worse. I think about my mother sometimes, how she tried to protect us from Margaret while still maintaining family harmony. She did the best she could with the tools she had, but I wonder sometimes if things might have been different if she'd stood up to her sister earlier. If she'd drawn firmer boundaries from the start. But that's the thing about hindsight. It's always 2020, and it doesn't account for the complex realities of family dynamics and the times we live in. But I know for sure, is that the cycle of control and manipulation ends when someone finds the courage to stand up and say, enough. Sarah did that. I did that. And now, hopefully, the next generation won't have to. Because we've already broken the chain. The entitled people of the world, the Margarets who believe the universe owes them obedience and compliance, they only have power if we give it to them. The moment we stop playing their games, the moment we refuse to accept their version of reality, their power evaporates like morning mist in sunshine. So here's to all the Sarahs out there, hanging up on the voices that try to control them. Here's to all the supportive family members who stand by them. Here's to the police officers who take family matters seriously, the judges who see through manipulation, and the friends who provide escape routes and safe harbors. And here's to the memory of those we've lost along the way, the parents and grandparents and loved ones who did their best to protect us and prepare us for a world that isn't always kind. They may be gone, but their lessons live on in how we treat each other, how we stand up for what's right, and how we refuse to let the Margarets of the world win. The real happy ending to this story isn't that Margaret got arrested or that she died alone. The real happy ending is that Sarah and I and everyone else she tried to control are living our best lives, free from her influence, surrounded by people who love us for who we are, not for what we can do for them. The real happy ending is that the entitlement died with Margaret, and it will never touch another generation of our family. That's the thing about entitled people. They create their own misery. They push away everyone who might have loved them in their quest for control. They die alone and unmourned, wondering why the world didn't bend to their will, never understanding that respect and love can't be demanded or stolen or manipulated into existence. They have to be earned, and Margaret never learned that lesson. But we did. Sarah did. I did. And that's why, despite all the pain and drama and loss, I can look back on that summer and be grateful. Not for Margaret's behavior, of course, but for what it taught us about standing up for ourselves, about the power of no, about the importance of boundaries and self-respect. Every time I help a patient stand up to a controlling family member, every time I see someone find the courage to live their own life, I think of that hot July day when Sarah hung up on her mother. Such a small act, just pressing a button on a phone, but it changed everything. It was the pebble that started an avalanche, the match that lit a fire, the first domino in a chain that would ultimately lead to freedom. So if you're reading this and you have a Margaret in your life, someone who thinks they own you, who volunteers you without asking, who believes their role in your life gives them ultimate authority over your choices, remember Sarah. Remember that you have the right to say no. Remember that you deserve respect. Remember that real love doesn't come with strings attached or demands for obedience. And remember that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply hang up the phone. Years have passed since that transformative summer, and life has a way of teaching us lessons we didn't even know we needed to learn. The story of Margaret and her need for control didn't end with her death. Not really, because the effects of that kind of manipulation ripple outward like stones thrown in a pond, touching lives in ways we don't always expect. I see it in my practice every day. The long-term effects of controlling behavior. Adult children who struggle to make decisions because someone else always made them. People who apologize constantly for existing, for having needs, for taking up space in the world. The recovery from that kind of emotional abuse isn't quick or easy, but it is possible, and that's what gives me hope. Sarah and I talk about it sometimes, during our monthly lunches. How different our lives might have been if Margaret had been a different kind of person. But then we realized that her dysfunction, painful as it was, shaped us into who we are today. Sarah became a nurse who advocates fiercely for her patients' autonomy. I became a psychiatrist who helps people break free from toxic patterns. We took our pain and transformed it into purpose. The ripple effects weren't all negative either. Sarah's children are growing up with a mother who respects their boundaries, who asks rather than demands, who guides rather than controls. They're confident, independent kids who know their own minds and aren't afraid to speak up. The cycle didn't just break, it reversed entirely. And that, I think, is the real legacy of that summer. Not the arrest, not the court case, not even Margaret's final estrangement from everyone who might have loved her. The real legacy is in how we chose to live differently, to be better, to ensure that the pain stopped with us. Sometimes I wonder what Margaret was like as a child. What happened to her that made her believe she had to control everything and everyone around her? Was there a moment when she could have chosen a different path? We'll never know, and perhaps it doesn't matter. What matters is that we can choose differently every day in every interaction with the people we love. That's the hope I hold on to. The message I try to convey to my patients and to anyone who needs to hear it: you are not doomed to repeat the patterns you grew up with. You can choose differently. You can be better. You can break the cycle. It starts with a single word: no. Such a small word, but containing such immense power. The power to define yourself, to set your boundaries, to claim your life as your own. Margaret never learned that other people's no was just as valid as her yes. She never learned that love isn't obedience and respect isn't automatic. But we learned, and we're teaching others, and someday, maybe the Margarets of the world will be extinct, replaced by people who understand that true strength comes not from controlling others, but from respecting them. Not from demanding obedience, but from earning trust. Until that day comes, we'll keep telling these stories. We'll keep standing up to the controllers and manipulators. We'll keep hanging up on the voices that try to tell us who we should be, instead of accepting who we are. And we'll keep living our lives on our own terms, free and whole and utterly, beautifully ourselves. That's the real victory. That's the happy ending. Not in someone else's downfall, but in our own rising. And that, more than anything else, is what makes it all worthwhile. The journey from that summer to now hasn't been a straight line. There were moments of doubt, times when I wondered if standing up to Margaret had been worth the family chaos it caused. During my mother's final months, when she was too weak to get out of bed but still sharp enough to worry about everything and everyone, she talked to me about family, about forgiveness, about the complicated nature of love. I always wondered if I should have done more. She said one evening, the setting sun painting her hospital room in shades of gold and amber. To protect Sarah from Margaret. To protect you. I held her hand, so thin now that I could see every vein, every bone. You did what you could, Mom. We all did. Did we, though? She turned to look at me, and in her eyes I saw all the regrets that come at the end of a life. I knew what Margaret was like. I knew she was hurting Sarah, but she was my sister, and I kept hoping she'd change. Hope isn't a crime, Mom. No, she agreed, but sometimes inaction in the face of injustice is. I let family politics and the desire to keep peace override what I knew was right. Don't make that mistake, Rachel. When you see someone being hurt, when you see injustice, speak up, even if it's family, especially if it's family. Those words stayed with me through her death, through my father's death, through all the years that followed. They guided me as I built my practice, as I counseled families torn apart by control and manipulation. They reminded me that keeping peace at any cost often means paying with someone's well-being, usually the most vulnerable person in the equation. I think about generational trauma a lot in my work, how patterns of behavior get passed down like heirlooms, each generation polishing them until they shine with the illusion of normalcy. Margaret learned somewhere that control meant safety, that obedience meant love. She passed that poison down to Sarah, wrapped in the pretty paper of maternal authority. But Sarah refused the gift, sent it back unopened, and in doing so, saved not just herself but her children and their children after them. The night before Margaret died, she called Sarah. It was 2 a.m. and Sarah almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up the phone. Margaret was in the hospital, her heart failing, and for the first time in her life, she was truly alone. Robert had been firm in the divorce. No contact meant no contact, not even deathbed reconciliations he didn't want. Sarah told me about that conversation during one of our lunches, tears streaming down her face as she pushed salad around her plate. Margaret hadn't apologized, not really. She'd said she was sorry Sarah had felt hurt, sorry things had gone the way they did, sorry they couldn't have a better relationship. But she never said she was sorry for what she'd done, never acknowledged the pain she'd caused, never admitted she'd been wrong. She asked me to come see her, Sarah said, wiping her eyes with a napkin. Said she was dying and didn't want to die alone. And you know what? For a moment, I almost went. That programming runs deep, you know? The daughter who obeys, who comes when called, who puts her mother's needs first. But you didn't go, I said, though it wasn't a question. No, I didn't. I told her I hoped she found peace and I hung up. She died 6 hours later. Sarah looked at me then, searching for something. Absolution, maybe, or understanding. Does that make me a terrible person? No, I said firmly. It makes you a person who learned that some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt just because someone decides they're ready to cross back over. You gave her years to change, decades to be a real mother. She chose control over connection every single time. The consequences of those choices don't disappear just because death is knocking at the door. Sarah nodded, but I could see she wasn't entirely convinced. That's the insidious thing about emotional abuse. It makes you doubt your own right to protect yourself. It makes you feel guilty for having boundaries, selfish for prioritizing your own well-being. Even years later, even after all the therapy and growth and healing, that voice in the back of your head whispers that maybe you're the one who's wrong. I see it in so many of my patients. They come to me twisted up with guilt about cutting off toxic family members, convinced they're bad children or ungrateful relatives. We work through it together, unpacking years of manipulation and control, learning to distinguish between genuine love and emotional blackmail. It's slow work, like untangling a massive knot one thread at a time, but it's necessary work. One of my most memorable patients was a woman named Diana who reminded me so much of Sarah it was eerie. Her mother had controlled every aspect of her life well into her 30s, choosing her college, her major, her job, even trying to select her husband. Diana had finally broken free after her mother had shown up at her workplace and tried to resign on her behalf because she didn't approve of Diana's career. She said she was doing it for my own good, Diana told me during one of our sessions, tears of frustration rolling down her cheeks. She always says that. Every controlling thing she's ever done was for my own good. But it never feels good. It feels like drowning. We worked together for 2 years, slowly building up Diana's confidence, her ability to say no, her understanding that she had the right to live her own life. The day she told me she'd blocked her mother's number was a breakthrough. The day she told me she'd gotten promoted at the job her mother had tried to make her quit was a celebration. But the day that really mattered was when she came in and said, "I realized something this week. I don't hate my mother. I nothing her. She's just irrelevant to my life now. Is that okay?" "How does it feel?" I asked. "Free," she said, and the smile on her face was radiant. "It feels free." That's what Margaret never understood. She thought control meant importance, that forced obedience meant love. But real importance comes from being someone people want in their lives, not someone they're obligated to tolerate. Real love is freely given, not extracted through manipulation or demanded through guilt. I've never married, as I mentioned, but not for lack of opportunity. I've had relationships, some lasting years, but I've never found someone who understood my need for independence the way I needed them to. Maybe it's a result of watching Margaret try to control everyone around her, or maybe it's just who I am. But I need space to breathe, to make my own choices, to live my own life. The right person would understand that, would celebrate it even. But I haven't found them yet, and I'm okay with that. Sarah, on the other hand, found exactly what she needed in Michael. He's the kind of partner who supports without smothering, who loves without conditions, who strengthens rather than diminishes. Watching them together at family gatherings is like watching a masterclass in healthy relationships. They disagree sometimes, of course they do, but they do it with respect. They make decisions together, real discussions where both opinions matter. It's everything Margaret's marriage wasn't. I asked Sarah once how she learned to have such a healthy relationship when all she'd seen growing up was dysfunction. "I did everything the opposite of what I saw," she said simply. Every time I had an instinct about how to handle something, I asked myself, what would Mom do? Then I did the opposite. It's worked out pretty well so far. We laughed about it, but there was truth in the humor. Sometimes the best teacher is a bad example, showing you exactly what not to do. Louis, my brother, has his own stories about Margaret. She'd tried to control him too, especially after his divorce, insisting she knew better than the courts about custody arrangements. She'd shown up at his daughter's school once, trying to pick them up without permission, claiming she was their great aunt and had every right. The school, thankfully, had protocols in place and called Louis instead of releasing the girls. He'd had to get a restraining order after that, adding to Margaret's collection. She really thought the rules didn't apply to her, he told me once, shaking his head. Like the world should just rearrange itself to match her expectations. "Narcissistic personality disorder with controlling tendencies," I said automatically, then caught myself. "Sorry, sometimes the psychiatrist in me can't help diagnosing." "No, you're probably right. Dad always said there was something not right about her. Even when they were kids. Said she'd throw these tantrums if things didn't go her way, and their parents just gave in to keep the peace. Maybe if they'd set boundaries when she was young." "Maybe," I agreed. "But we can't change the past. We can only learn from it, and learn we have. Every family gathering now is a testament to what healthy relationships look like. Sarah's kids run wild with Lewis's grandchildren, free to be themselves without fear of criticism or control. We share meals where everyone's dietary choices are respected, have conversations where disagreement doesn't mean disrespect. Make plans that take everyone's schedules and preferences into account. It's the family Margaret could have had if she'd been willing to see other people as equals, rather than subjects. The saddest part of Margaret's story, I think, is how unnecessary it all was. She had a daughter who would have loved her unconditionally if she'd just given her room to breathe. She had an extended family who would have welcomed her if she'd been willing to respect boundaries. She had a husband who stayed for 40 years before finally having enough. She had so much, and she threw it all away for the illusion of control. In my practice, I keep a small framed quote on my desk where patients can see it. Control is not love. Obedience is not respect. Fear is not loyalty. Simple truths that shouldn't need stating, but for so many people raised in controlling households, they're revelations. I had a patient once ask me, "But how do you know the difference? How do you know if someone really loves you or if they just want to control you?" Love wants you to grow, I told her. Control wants you to shrink. Love celebrates your independence. Control punishes it. Love trusts. Control surveils. Love lets go. Control holds tighter. If you're not sure which one you're experiencing, ask yourself, do I feel larger or smaller in this person's presence? Do I feel more myself or less? She cried then, because she knew the answer. Her tears were part grief for the love she'd thought she had and part relief at finally understanding what she'd actually been experiencing. That's often how it goes. The truth hurts before it heals. I sometimes drive past the courthouse where Margaret was tried, and I remember that day with perfect clarity. The way she'd stood up and ranted about injustice, completely unable to see that justice was exactly what was happening. She'd spent so many years in her own reality where her word was law that actual law seemed like a personal attack. The prosecutor from that case, the young woman who'd seemed so fresh-faced but had argued so brilliantly, is a judge now. Ran into her at a legal conference where I was speaking about family dynamics and custody disputes, and we recognized each other immediately. "That case," she said, shaking her head with a smile. "I tell my clerks about it when they think family court is boring. Your aunt was something else." "That's one way to put it," I agreed. "How's your cousin doing? Sarah, right?" "Thriving. Married, kids, successful career. Everything Margaret said she'd never have without her guidance. Good for her. I see too many cases where people never break free. It's nice to know some stories have happy endings." Happy endings? It's a relative term, isn't it? Margaret dead and unmourned doesn't feel like a happy ending, even if it brought peace to those she'd tormented. Sarah free but still carrying scars isn't exactly a fairy tale. Me, unmarried and sometimes lonely but fiercely independent, is that happy? But then I think about the alternatives. Sarah still under Margaret's thumb, afraid to live her own life. Me shipped off to live with an aunt who would have tried to control my every breath. Future generations growing up thinking that love means control and family means obedience to arbitrary rules. Compared to those possibilities, yes, I'd call our endings happy. The last time I saw Margaret alive was at a grocery store, of all places. It was about a year before she died, well after the restraining orders had expired, but when everyone was still maintaining careful distance. I was picking up ingredients for dinner, lost in thought, when I heard that voice that could still make my spine stiffen after all those years. "Rachel?" I turned, and there she was. Older, grayer, somehow smaller than I remembered. She was alone, her cart containing the sad provisions of a solitary life. Single-serving frozen dinners, one banana, a small carton of milk. "Aunt Margaret," I said, neutral, polite, giving her nothing. "I heard you became a doctor," she said. And for once there was no sarcasm, no dismissal, just a statement of fact. "Psychiatrist," I confirmed. "Your mother would be proud," she said. And that surprised me. Margaret never gave compliments without barbs. "Yes," I agreed. "She would be." We stood there for a moment, two women in the cereal aisle, carrying the weight of all that history between us. I waited for her to say something else. To apologize, maybe, or to attack, or to try one more time to assert some kind of authority over me. But she just nodded and wheeled her cart away. leaving me standing there among the cornflakes and possibilities. I never told Sarah about that encounter. Some things don't need sharing, and I think Sarah needed Margaret to remain the villain of her story, needed that clarity to maintain her boundaries. But for me, seeing Margaret alone with her single-serve dinners, I felt something I hadn't expected. Pity. Not forgiveness, never that, but pity for a woman who'd chosen control over connection and ended up with neither. That's the real cautionary tale here. Not that controlling people get arrested or die alone, though those things might happen. The real warning is that when you try to control others, you lose the chance for real relationships. When you demand obedience instead of earning respect, you end up with neither. When you mistake fear for love, you end up with emptiness. I carry these lessons with me every day. When I'm tempted to give unsolicited advice, I remember Margaret volunteering Sarah for everything. When I want to insist I know best, I remember Margaret destroying Sarah's license and thinking she'd won. When I feel the urge to control an outcome, I remember Margaret alone in the grocery store with her single banana and frozen dinners. So I choose differently. I choose to ask rather than tell. I choose to listen rather than dictate. I choose to love with open hands rather than closed fists. It's not always easy. That urge to control, to make things go the way we want them to, it's human nature. But it's a nature we can overcome with conscious effort and constant vigilance. The teenagers who come to my practice, brought by parents who just want what's best, but can't see they're suffocating their children, they give me hope. Because this generation questions everything, including the idea that parents always know best or that family means accepting any treatment. They're setting boundaries younger, speaking up sooner, refusing to accept because I said so, as a valid reason for anything. My mom says I owe her obedience because she gave birth to me. One 16-year-old patient told me recently. But I didn't ask to be born, that was her choice. Why does her choice mean I don't get to make any of my own? Smart kid. I told her that owing someone basic respect and owing them complete control over your life are very different things. That gratitude for good parenting doesn't mean accepting bad treatment. That loving someone doesn't mean letting them hurt you. These are the conversations that matter. The ones that plant seeds of healthy boundaries and self-respect. Every person who learns they have the right to say no is one less Margaret in the making, one less Sarah suffering in silence, one less family torn apart by the need to control. And that's how we change the world, really. Not through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, though those have their place. We change it through small acts of respect for autonomy, through asking instead of telling, through letting the people we love be who they are instead of who we think they should be. We change it by breaking cycles and healing trauma, and choosing differently than those who came before us. Margaret's story ended the day she died, but the ripples of her life continue to spread. In Sarah's gentle parenting, in my work with families, in the way we all think twice before volunteering someone else for something without asking first. Even in death, she's teaching lessons, just not the ones she intended to teach. And perhaps that's the final irony. Margaret spent her entire life trying to control the narrative, trying to make everyone follow her script. But in the end, we each wrote our own stories, and they were far better than anything she could have imagined. That's the power of breaking free. That's the gift of saying no. That's the beauty of living your own life on your own terms. And yes, more than anything else, that's what makes it all worthwhile.